Hey, everybody. Welcome to React Native Radio. Today on the panel, we have Josh Justice.
Hey, everyone.
And Charles Max Wood.
Hey, everybody.
And I'm today's host, Chris Reyes. And today we're going to be talking about React Native pros and cons, and we're going to base it off an article we'll link in the show notes by NetGuru. So a cool aspect of this article is they wrote it initially when they got into the React Native space, and this is an update after having a considerable amount of experience at working with React Native.
When I'm building a new product, G2I is the company that I call on to help me find a developer who can build the first version. G2I is a hiring platform run by engineers that matches you with React, React Native, GraphQL, and mobile engineers who you can trust. Whether you are a new company building your first product or an established company that wants additional engineering help, G2I has the talent you need to accomplish your goals. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about what G2I has to offer. In my experience, G2I is linked up with experienced developers that can fit my budget, and the G2I staff are friendly and easy to work with. They know how product development works and can help you find the perfect engineer for your stack. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about G2I.
Yeah, I didn't catch this article in the first place, but I'm excited to see it now, excited to see folks kind of tracking with the changes in the community. I mean, there's another number of years that React Native has under its belt now. So I was excited to go through it in preparation for today's episode.
Yeah, well, and this is a conversation that I have frequently since, on devchat.tv, we have an iOS native show where we talk about Swift and things like that. And then, talking about this, and I've got a project coming down the pike. Look out the beginning of the year for the Kickstarter for that, where we're really going to need a mobile app. And, and so people are talking to me about, do I do React Native or do I do iOS and Android native, or do I go with something like Ionic / Cordova? And anyway, it's really kind of an interesting space to play in. Incidentally, we're also on Views on Vue going to have a Vue plus Cordova. So they're not using Ionic or any other framework on top of Cordova. We're having that episode recorded tomorrow. And so anyway, it's just interesting to kind of dig in and go, what's going on, right? And yeah.
Yeah, and this article does a real good job of seeing it from multiple perspectives. And, another thing to take into account too is team size. So, I mean, as we get through the details, we'll see how that can affect the implementation of React Native in your company. But, the common baseline that's great about, Ionic, Vue Native or React Native is obviously having the one code base for multiple platforms. So obviously that's the real big pro. Josh, when you first, were coming to this, what were your thoughts about having one code base for multiple, environments? Were you hesitant? Did it seem too good to be true? I know you were in a Java land where they originally had the, write once, run everywhere kind of idea.
I think before I came to React Native, I wasn't thinking too much about cross-platform development personally. Big Nerd Ranch builds native iOS apps, native Android apps, web apps. And so in those days, I was a web developer, so I did the web part. And I had done an iOS app on the side. And so for my own personal project, cool, I'll get into iOS, built it out like it was good. There was no rush on it. I wanted to learn some iOS to get a taste for it anyway, so that was very motivating. I'm not coming to React Native myself with as much of a comparison in terms of other approaches that I have taken or projects that I've been on have taken for cross-platform targeting or anything like that. React Native does seem very appealing to me for cross-platform. I certainly, and I might be able to keep up iOS knowledge on the side. I would not be able to also learn Android on the side myself and keep that going. When money is no object, you can, of course, and hiring is no object because it can be hard to hire for mobile developers or any developers sometimes. So when money's no object and you can hire, of course, you can get an iOS team and an Android team. Some of the points in the article, though, talk about how even if you can do that, there's still positives to React Native. But yeah, some of the personal factors that impact me, my perspective and where I come from, as a front-end developer, already knowing React is very, very helpful to get into React Native. The article mentioned that as one of the points is, when your team already knows React, then the boundary to get into React Native is smaller than Flutter or anything else out there. So it's very appealing for me. And for organizations where they already have a React web app and are looking to add new native apps, that's one of the sweetest spots that I could see for React Native. Lots of other pros and cons in the article we can discuss, but that's some of the thoughts that occur to me. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, that's actually, let's kind of go through these point by point, because I think that's the article is kind of laid out beautifully for that. So the first point is faster to build. And this week at work, I've been working with another hybrid cross-platform environment. And I'm really noticing how fast it is to build and get set up and running with React Native. And especially when it comes to debugging, it is just, the setup, especially if you're coming from a React Native or just React, having the create React app kind of environment. When you flow into React Native, if you're using Expo or the CLI, getting up and running with like a web console just to see logs is so nice, versus some other environment setup. Now, I don't have firsthand experience with setting up a Swift app or a straight Android app, but just running logs in Xcode and kind of having to fish through them for me, has been a little bit difficult. So that's why I really appreciate, the faster development time of React Native and having that access to the, Chrome Web Console or whatever console you're using.
Another thing they mentioned in that section of the article was the framework provides numerous ready-to-apply components that can accelerate the process. And they mentioned third-party packages available as well. So I think there's a pro and con there in my mind. Maybe I'm overly in the middle, and they'll be very frustrating for listeners. But so I see a pro and a con here where, yes, React Native Core and React Native Community provide a bunch of access to native functionality. And there are a bunch of third-party packages as well. In contrast to iOS in particular, as iOS doesn't have an official, widely adopted package system, Swift Package Manager is still up and coming, the last I heard about it. So you tend to not reach for open source software quite as often on iOS native development, and tend to not build it. And so just the fact that that's in the DNA of the React world and the JavaScript world is very helpful. I will say...
I need to comment on that a little bit, because CocoaPods is a thing, right, in iOS. And people have been using it for a long time. But yeah, it's not something that everybody uses. It's all written in Ruby as well. So you wind up using this. You have to install Ruby in order to use CocoaPods to build your Swift apps. So there is still a little bit of, how do I put it? Just, there's an extra barrier there. I mean, you don't have to know Ruby to use it, but it's and I think there's, what is it? Shiplane or
Fastlane?
Fastlane, yeah, which is also written in Ruby. So there are tools. It's interesting to me that all those tools are written in Ruby. But in order to do a lot of the stuff there, you wind up pulling in, a Ruby runtime in order to make it work. The flip side is I don't know if Android has one at all. And
I think Maven is sort of a package-based platform back from the Java server-side days. It seems like it's used as well. So to me, the Java community, Android community seems to have a bit more of a default approach to package management. And so your clarification is really good. Like on iOS, there's not a default approach. There's an alternative called Carthage. I at least have run across folks that have strong opinions against CocoaPods. So I think there's a mixed view there, whereas there's almost no JavaScript developers that would say, NPM, forget NPM. I would never use NPM. It's like, you kind of do. Like, it's just sort of where people go.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard people complain about NPM. Some of it's political, some of it's functional, some of it's other stuff. A lot of people have different reasons for not really necessarily 100% liking NPM or the way that they've done certain things, but it's kind of the default way of going, and there's not a way around it. So yeah.
I found a bit of the article that ties to what I was saying. So, Chris, I'm going to jump ahead to the cons sections to make a parallel. One of the cons listed says there's a lack of some custom modules. Some functionality that's either built into the native OSs or third-party code is not directly accessible through React Native JavaScript modules, and so those need to be written. The article kind of downplays that. I feel like in my work, it's been sort of a mixed bag. The example that I give often is when I'm not using Expo, getting audio APIs or getting push notifications. Like, there are certainly packages there. There were several different audio packages. The steps to integrate them seemed kind of challenging. I think for the audio ones, I had to sort of assess which seemed to still be maintained. And so I feel like the availability of custom modules to access native interfaces is kind of a mixed bag in the React Native world. I still love React Native, but I don't personally assume that I'll be able to find a JavaScript package for anything I might possibly need for React Native. Where would you put yourself, Chris, on that? Like, do you feel like those packages are almost always there? Do you often find yourself needing to custom build something at the native level?
No, I have not run into that. I mean, a lot of it's been mostly standard. I haven't, run into a situation where I needed something extremely, different from what's offered out of the box. Like I used a React Native camera in Maps pretty early. And there was some, native tweaking at that point that is covered now. So I never had to do any kind of specific native implementation. But I do think that the ecosystem of JavaScript kind of adds a different kind of pro/con to this that the article kind of misses out is, because there's no standard navigation or ways to handle camera or, whatever. It kind of leads you to that level of, R&D that needs to be done when you're working on a project. And, with that, it offers, you need kind of that multifaceted knowledge of all of the different ecosystems between Android, iOS, and JavaScript. And, the last point I want to point out is, if you're like me, it can kind of put you in that analysis paralysis where, when you're trying to choose a navigation library, it's going to take a considerable amount of research because you want to choose what's right. You have to think about the packages, the commits, the maintainers. There's just a lot there to unpack where in a native land, obviously, that's all taken away from you. So it's a blessing and a curse, I guess, is the only kind of phrase I can come up with. I don't know if you guys kind of agree with that or if you lean more on the side of, no, like having decisions made for us is what's best long term.
I'm going to jump in on this too. I agree generally, but of course I kind of came up doing Rails where a lot of those decisions were mostly made for me and I would just vary when I had a really solid reason to do it. And so, yeah, I like having the decisions made for me in a lot of ways. One other thing related to, what we're talking about with the kind of support you get for some of these things is that, so I bought a React Native template for a video app and I figured I could just adapt it to audio, right? I would just pull all the video interface out and drop audio in, but I wanted to get it to build first. And I've upgraded my Mac to macOS Catalina. And so when I pulled it in, it told me immediately that it couldn't build it and that I had to upgrade it. So I upgraded React Native, the React Native app to the latest React Native. And then it wouldn't build because it can't find references to the video library and things like that. And so, it's interesting just from the sense that if it were all, kind of like what Chris has implied a little bit, if it were all JavaScript, it wasn't using stuff from these other ecosystems, it wouldn't be as big a deal. It wouldn't be looking for the header files and the native built stuff and things like that. And so you wind up fighting some of those battles too, where you have to play the integration game with it. But that said, I mean, the flip side is that I don't have to go learn Swift, right? I don't have to go learn Kotlin, and I don't have to figure out how to build two different apps as much. There is a little bit of that you run into with React Native, but not to the degree of, I've got two completely different ecosystems that I've got to support. So yeah, so there's that as well. It is one framework, and but some of the native stuff is still just not quite so seamless that it just works.
Right. I mean, one of the things you get from iOS in particular, and some of the more conservative clients and iOS developers I've interacted with would say this, is that, Apple releases a new OS, Apple releases a new Xcode. And so they are integrating all their things. They all work together. Although, I think they also acknowledge some of Apple's limitations. They might deprecate some of their services and things like that. But you probably won't get into situations where it's like, things just doesn't work. New Xcode, nothing works. Because you're on that central path and like that. And that is a sense in which iOS native development is very unified. Everybody's using Xcode. The tools all provided by Apple. The APIs are all provided by Apple. The hardware, of course, everybody knows this about iOS, that integration there. And so that is an aspect where you're on the well-trodden path for iOS native development. Should we go on to other points within the article?
Yeah, so we kind of have talked about the next 2 points, but I think we should probably just key in on them. So the second point is one framework, multiple platforms. They kind of point to the idea of code sharing across multiple platforms, obviously Android, iOS, but then they pull on the web because you can use some of your code for web. And, a lot of this, as Charles has mentioned, you do run into some issues, but the React Native Platforms package kind of, can be a remedy for this. You have, here and there, you might need an if statement and check which environment you're in, and you may need to render a little bit differently. But, I obviously that was one of the things I ran into at first was, Native Base does a good job of handling this, of how things should look on each platform. And they obviously leverage that platform package a lot. And another issue too is the iPad and how things should look. And so I think it's the device package where you can kind of check the aspect ratio and, see what screen you're on and change your layout for an iPad. So React Native, I feel like in that area, does a good job of kind of giving you those tools, kind of dive in and see where you're at and change how things should look and rendered and act.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a big thing where you can see it kind of everywhere as you work on it. I really, really dig that.
And I would describe this area not just in terms of code sharing, but just also sharing the just development approach. Whether I'm actually sharing components across the web and iOS and Android, for the projects I think about, I would almost always have a single React Native project that does target both iOS and Android. With my web background, I'm often likely to have a separate React web application. And for the hobby project I mentioned last week, I'm doing that. So I don't share component code across them, although there's a few interesting approaches for doing that. Data layer code, I might very well share, just kind of standalone plain JavaScript classes and modules and things like that. But even if I'm not sharing any code across the projects, or it's totally separate projects, maybe I have a different, my app for the web is a different app with a different use than my app for React Native. And yet it's still using the React rendering model, and it's still using Redux for the data layer, and it's still using the JavaScript language and ECMAScript and Jest for testing. And so just being in the same tools with the same approaches, I think that itself is a huge time savings and cost savings. And the things you learn, I learned this weird thing about JavaScript promises and something I was getting wrong, and now I've got it right. That now applies to all the applications I work on. So that can lead to, I guess I should jump right there. We'll talk a little bit later about smaller teams and kind of unifying it there, avoiding those silos between languages and tooling, just because there's so much you need to learn to work in each of those silos. And that's why I would say that there's a meme that's been around the industry for a while about you're not a React Native developer or a JavaScript developer, you're a developer. Just think of yourself as a developer, and developers can work in any language. And I think in some sense that's right, and I definitely support learning from different ecosystems. On the flip side, we shouldn't assume that we can be instantly productive in any other ecosystem, because there's things about the tooling you need to learn, and there's things about the mental model, and there's edge cases and bugs. It's like, oh yeah, there's this thing in Android Studio you always have to do to fix it. You just learn those things with time. And so our human capacities aren't infinite. And so if I can go deep in the JavaScript and React ecosystems, that pays dividends, versus if my time and attention, or my team's time and attention, is spread out across multiple platforms. So I see that benefit there, even if there's zero code sharing per se between the projects.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I feel good about that point. You guys ready to move on to the next one?
Yeah, the only other thing that I'll add here is that, and I don't know if this is discussed in one of the other points, but just that, React Native, makes the claim, and I think it's a fair claim, that, you're running a lot of stuff with native UIs. And one of the things that I've run into with some of the other, obviously if you're writing native code, it's going to have a native UI. The other one that comes to mind that also does a native UI is NativeScript, which is a Telerik/Progress platform. But if you're using like Ionic or Cordova, a lot of that is actually built in a web view when you're using web technologies. And it's gotten a lot better. Like you almost can never tell nowadays that which way it's running, but they still have to actually go and translate that and make sure that the performance and things like that work. And, in this case, that native angle on things just really makes it, at least to me, it feels like more like an app, and works, generally how I would expect it to. And like I said, I think the Ionics and Cordovas of the world, do that as well. But they've got to go and make sure that it's actually doing that, because it's not the native UI, it's something else. And so they've got to do more work to make it get there, where this kind of happens automatically, and then it's, connecting over the JavaScript bridge to everything else that you're responsible for, that, you have to make sure, runs nicely on that end. And so it takes one concern out of the package for you.
That makes a lot of sense, Chuck. And there's something you said that I think you said it well. And I think there's ways that the article, I think, describes it that folks could misunderstand. When folks say about React Native, oh, your JavaScript compiles down to native code.
Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. Also check out Chain React, the React Native conference, which is hosted by Infinite Red in July in Portland with 500 developers from all around the world. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad.
So that is not quite correct. And I think it's helpful to kind of learn what's going on under the hood and to have the right mental model to understand the trade-offs. And again, you said this right, but I think the article could be misunderstood. So it's helpful for folks to know that React Native is still executing your JavaScript. So there is a JavaScript runtime that's running JavaScript code on your device. That's how things like Code Push and Expo are able to deploy updates over the air because new JavaScript code is sent. So the business logic of your app in that way is running in JavaScript at real time. The stuff that happens at the native level is native user interface widgets are still used. So it's like the brain of your app is running in JavaScript and is calling out to all these native things that are happening to make native things happen on the screen, right. Other APIs behind the scenes and things like that. I think of it like there's a big ball of JavaScript in the middle of your app and the user interface is on one side. Yeah. A big ball of JavaScript control center in the middle. There's UI on one end and then like device APIs on the other end. That's where things happen natively. But yeah, in the section of the article where it compared other cross-platform alternatives, I'm not actually sure with Flutter and with Xamarin if they may actually compile down to native code, Objective-C or Java bytecode. I'm not totally sure, but at least with React Native, it is JavaScript that's running at runtime, and I think it can be helpful for folks to understand.
Yeah, I've spoken to members of the Xamarin team on multiple occasions. It statically compiles C# to iOS runtime and JVM runtime. So they are full-on native apps at the end of the day. Flutter, I don't know.
Cool. Chris, you were ready to move on to the next point, so we can do that if you like.
Yeah, so the next point is hot reloading, and I've had a lot of experience with that this past week, just working in a different environment. And, obviously it makes such a big deal. And one of the points this article kind of doesn't mention either is over-the-air updates, which is, I feel like, a pretty huge benefit if you've ever gone through a deployment process for an application. But, being able to make those small tweaks to a UI and see how it looks as you're working through it and seeing it automatically reload is huge, and especially when you're hot reloading, you're moving data around and you want to just log out and see how things are looking or attaching a debugger. This is just such a huge benefit. But, unfortunately, I haven't worked in Swift, so I can't give, or Androids per se. So I can't kind of key in completely on what that development environment feels like. But I have worked with other developers, and I know the Xcode build process, when your app starts to get to that complex state, the build is one of the steps that really does slow your development time down.
Yeah, if I understand right about React Native's architecture, there was previously a concept of live reloading and hot reloading, where live reloading would catch a change to your code and say, cool, I'm going to restart your app. The native code's still running, but I'm going to reload the JavaScript and kick the app off from start. Whereas hot reloading attempted to keep the app, the componentry running the same with all of your component state and Redux state and everything like that, and just swap out the JavaScript code that was used for individual components. And the hope there would be that if you had navigated down to a deep point in your application, that it would be able to keep you on the same screen with new JavaScript code running, but your state is not lost. Now, if I understand right, in React Native 0.61, a new feature called Fast Refresh was released that replaced both of them. I think Dan Abramov was working on this, and as you might imagine, stuff Dan works on, he's a pretty knowledgeable guy. It's going to tend to work pretty well. But the idea here is that this was intended to address some of the instability with hot reloading. It's an inherently hard computer science problem, I think, to keep your data there and swap out the code that runs underneath it. And so I think Fast Refresh was written to attempt to fix that. So I haven't noticed it like to dug in a bit in depth to see the differences and if it runs better or what. But for folks that are on React Native 0.61, look for fast refresh in your developer menu and give it a try and see how it runs. Do you know if you're on 61, Chris?
I'll have to check. I imagine I am, because that little sample thing I spun up was only 2 weeks ago. And I was noticing I think I had mentioned with like the installation of React Native and just like the CLI, everything was being driven through NPX because the actual CLI was moved off of core for that. I'm blanking out on what the like movement was called. But yeah, I imagine I am. I'll have to check and look for that in the menu.
Yeah, I know that for iOS apps, I haven't tried to build one in a while, but the process at least a year or so ago was that you would tell it to build the app and then it would reload your simulator. And so, yeah, if your app took a minute or two to load, you'd be sitting there waiting for a minute or two before your changes were reflected. So, having anything that can essentially, reload your app without you having to wait for that process, because React Native apps still take, a second or two to build. Something that can give you that fast feedback is really, really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, especially, even if it is a minute, I mean, that process takes a minute, but in 1 minute, I can get distracted so easy and end up losing 10 minutes, just checking email or looking at messages. So that hot reloading.
Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
Twitter.
I'm not cool enough for a Twitter, but if like a, flashlight, a shiny light pops in my window, I'll be like, what's that? And just leave my office. But, hot reloading, it just kind of gives you that instantaneous feedback to when you're when you're in the beginning of your development, like career. Seeing something automatically give you that feedback kind of gives you that sense of accomplishment, which is super beneficial when you're getting started.
All right, what's next?
Cool. Yeah. So let's move on to the next one. We've kind of touched on this a couple times. It's smaller teams is the next point. And obviously the huge benefit here is, even if you can still have a large team, but the coordinating cross technologies, sometimes, when you're working with different developers, there's different languages that can be spoken between a Java developer, a Swift developer, and a JavaScript person. So you can kind of come down to, common, knowledge in terms of whatever you're building, but there's, no kind of substitute for having someone who's built maybe a web implementation of the application and then moving over to a mobile version of that. So they have an idea of what kind of, idiosyncrasies are in the actual data and how the app should function and move. And now that they're on a mobile environment, being able to kind of tap into some of the, animations that navigation can offer, or any other kind of added, benefits of being in mobile.
Usually when I hear folks talk about smaller teams with React Native, it's the idea of just needing fewer developers total. Like, if you're not building the code twice, you don't need as many developers. You build it once, and maybe there's a little cross-platform overhead, but it's less than a full iOS team and a full Android team. But I love the focus of this article that talked about communication. And that's just what you said, Chris, as well, that knowledge that you get from building the feature on one platform and that it can apply on the other side, or that you can be building the feature at the same time. And I think just that communication approach where you don't have these separate groups. I think, like, even from a hypothetical standpoint, if I was just building mobile applications and I could have 5 iOS developers or 5 Android developers, or 10 developers that are all working on the same technology, I think there's major communication benefits to have the 10 developers on the same technology, because there's just a freer flow of information. And I'm someone that doesn't believe you can just like write out a specification and there we go, now we'll build the app. Like, you have to learn and figure things out as you build it as a team, how you need to implement it, what requirements the business actually has, what is actually going to be the most useful. And that informal flow of information works better when you're on a shared technology. It's not the only factor, of course, but given that I think that React Native is a really great technology, there's those communication, team, interpersonal benefits of all being on the same stack.
Yeah, I find this one a little bit maybe. And I agree with you, Josh, on your points there. I also think that, there's going to be some level of shared logic, between the two apps, your Android app and your iOS app, right? And so, besides the communication, which I think is always the most critical aspect these days of building software, is your ability of your team to communicate. The flip side is that, you're going to have some shared stuff, and that's going to make things a lot easier just in general. One thing that I would also point out, though, is that some of your shared logic could be pushed down to an API or serverless functions or things like that. And so there are other ways to mitigate some of this stuff. And so, yeah, I kind of saw this and I was like, it probably depends on your use case. I think you're going to get some mileage out of using the same platform for both teams or both aspects of your team. But yeah, depending on what you're doing, you may wind up having to have an iOS and an Android expert on your team anyway, at least one of each, so that they can fix the issues that are going to crop up that are outside of the expertise of everybody else. So I think this is much more case by case basis than the other things that have been brought up here.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and the article points it out too. If it's a complex application, then at that point it might not even be a good fit for the framework. But obviously, yeah, it's one of those things where it is a benefit in some situations, but given the use case, it could also be a drawback because now if you do have a smaller team and you're juggling multiple applications, are you running tight on resources? But due to the nature of the framework, it is an easier talent pool to pull from. So yeah, this one is definitely a little bit of a gray area. It's kind of got that pro and con feel to it. I don't know how you feel about that, Josh.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, but that said, I mean, yeah, I think generally you're right, Josh. The other thing that I also want to just throw in here to keep in mind is that depending on what your budget is, the size of your team is, how you're going to divide up responsibilities and things like that, your mileage may vary there too, right? It may not save you a smaller team. It may allow you to assign more people to other functionality, or it may just turn out that you still need that many mobile developers and that you're still going to have a web team on the back end that's going to build your APIs and things like that.
This ties into our 4 approach episode about Josh's article where, yeah, if you do, this might be an opportunity where you have your web team writing certain components that are being integrated into a native app, I think is kind of another benefit of React Native. One of the pros, I might say, that maybe this article might miss. And it's just something for the audience to keep in mind. All right. Josh, did you have anything to add before I cut you off? Or did you want to move on to the next point?
Yeah, let's keep going.
Cool. So the next point is fast applications. So this one, I guess, in terms of the pros, might be a little bit one of the more controversial ones. But the article actually has a use case where they built an app in native code and then built one in React Native and compared speed times. And it was actually relatively similar, and they didn't really notice any kind of user discrepancies or anything like that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting point because obviously a lot of companies don't have those resources where they can do that. And this might kind of settle some of the concerns of those who were just kind of on the fence of React Native. I mean, I was surprised to see that. What were your guys' thoughts?
I agreed that that would be controversial. I think the post definitely came down seemingly on the extreme of like, hey, performance is not a problem. And I think there's a mix there. I think, and this is a good point about evaluation. Folks want to be able to decide React Native is fast or React Native is slow. And unfortunately, there's just a lot more trade-offs than that. I think, Facebook for the last few years has been working on gradually rewriting the internals of React Native to handle a number of different performance issues. Or you could say to create an architecture that more naturally supports the highest possible performance needed. Facebook wouldn't be putting that in that effort if the performance was totally perfect. Ram N from Facebook gave a talk at Chain React, and then he was a guest on React Native Radio on episode 130. And so his talk was about performance. And he was actually talking about things that you can do today to increase the performance of your app. He made a point in particular at the start of his talk that was really great, where he was hearing folks say, React Native is slow on the app he was working on. He's like, well, what do you mean by that? And he really dug in. And when he got down to it, is like, these are specific things that are happening in our app that users are perceiving as slow. Okay, cool. Like now we can look into those. But if nothing else, the asynchronous nature of the JavaScript bridge is something that is often brought up and Facebook brings up. And a lot of the new architecture that's coming for React Native is meant to address that, to provide synchronous ways for data to flow back and forth in ways that are going to kind of prevent some insurmountable problems with things kind of falling behind the 60 frames per second that you might otherwise want. So I think this is something where you kind of need to know the needs of your application. I'm sure some folks have made games in React Native. If that 60 frame per second video game is the biggest need you have, maybe Unity would be better, or native code. But if at the other extreme, if you just have a form-based app, probably performance isn't the biggest deal. You'll be able to scroll a table view and see your data. It should be fine. And maybe your app is somewhere in the middle. So I would definitely say that performance is a mixed bag, and it would be good for folks to look into the implications of React Native when they decide to choose it, depending on how big a deal performance is. But of course, folks can tend to say, oh, I want it all. I want to build an app that's going to be as performant as possible, even though I just have a form app. Well, you're losing something. There are trade-offs. You are paying a cost to get that maximum possible performance that your app may not need.
I want to know how they measured the performance here. I mean, that's really where I get stuck. Is I look at it and I'm thinking, you know what? There are probably some apps. I think you said it the right way, Josh. Some apps not going to matter. Some apps it may be faster to run React Native. Who knows? Some may not. I want to see how they measure it and then essentially kind of work from there. Because in the simple case, I'm guessing that it was forms over data, runs real fast. Scroll your table view, you're set, right? But what are we doing? Where are we measuring the performance? How do we actually see where it makes a difference? The other thing is that for the most part, if it scrolls and moves and acts the same way as a native app within a few milliseconds or something, I probably won't be able to tell, and it won't matter. And so, I want to know, what are we actually measuring, and how do we actually know?
Yeah, I mean, this point alone can be its own article / dissertation. I mean, really, in terms of what they're measuring and, what's the use case and the control. And it's interesting too, because the navigation aspect too, because if, I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but, one of the cons is navigation. So I'm curious to see if they ever do release anything, what that app will look like.
Yeah, data is very helpful.
Yep.
Cool. You guys want to move on to the last point for the pros?
Yeah, let's do it.
In this one, they're calling it simplified UI. And I feel like this might relate to my first point in terms of, debugging in React Native and, seeing logs and just some of the other tools out there like Redux DevTools or Reactotron, being able to kind of, time travel through your app and see where things fell apart or where things are working. But that was kind of the main point of this section, was just the usability of developing in React Native, really.
Declarative programming is the big point that I took away from this section, declarative rendering. And that is very, very huge for me. Having done a little bit of iOS development, it was an imperative UI. You have to call a function or a method to change something in the UI. And so to be able to just say, here's what my API should look like as a function of state. I don't have a philosophical preconception of liking that, but practically for the apps I'm working on, it's just so nice to change the data and the UI automatically updates. Ash Furrow had a blog post a while back, and I'll put that in the show notes, where he's arguing, giving the case for React Native for native developers and saying that declarative UIs are a big, big benefit and a reason to reach for it. This is why Apple's come out with Swift UI, and Google or the Android team has come up with Jetpack Compose, which are both, if I understand correctly, declarative UI implementations, but on top of Swift, on top of Kotlin. And so they see, hey, whether we use JavaScript or not, whether we try to go cross-platform or not, declarative UI is extremely productive. And those tools have gotten great early reviews. React Native has a lot more years under its belt. So it's really interesting that the third-party JavaScript framework has a lot more maturity than these first-party native code frameworks when it comes to declarative UI. But the declarative UI is a huge, huge win for me. That's one where I can't think of a lot of cases where there would be the benefit of imperative UI.
I don't have enough experience in this arena to really comment on it. So, hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just launched my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's up on Amazon. We self-published it. I would love your support. If you want to go check it out, you can find it there. The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. Have a good one. Max out.
All right. Well, I think that we hit that point pretty well. So let's move on to the cons of React Native. And the first one they want to point out is less smooth navigation, which, the apps I've worked in, it's been mostly data form-based. And I haven't really run into this because there isn't a ton of animation. And I actually just watched a talk this morning about React Navigation 5, and they're doing a lot of stuff in-house to kind of handle some of these issues and kind of tapping into the native APIs. But I do know that, throughout React Native's history, the past couple of years, this has been one of the pain points in terms of, getting the native feel and making it feel smooth and just overall kind of even development struggles.
Yeah, I would definitely group with this with performance in general. A lot of times with where we are in 2019, the navigation libraries you have are probably fine. If your needs are really, really demanding, you're navigating around really quickly, that it's probably worth a proof of concept to try it out first to see if it can meet your performance needs. But I think we're in a good state with navigation options right now. That's not a part that I'm too concerned when I'm evaluating React Native's fitness for different projects.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of I think I agree with both of you in the sense that we've seen a number of navigation libraries come up and nobody's been 100% satisfied with all of them. And yeah, there's still issues there. But I mean, for the most part, it seems like the general cases work. And, so for the most part, we can kind of work through that and deal with them and be okay with them for now. But yeah, if you're trying to do something customized or weird or anything like that, then that's an issue.
Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of what we'll run into these issues is if you have something irregular and you want to do, some kind of nested, custom, item that, you have your own animation you build. I feel like, yeah, you'll see issues there just because you're kind of, working across native APIs and going across a bridge and trying to, use the tool out of sort. So I feel like, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree. And yeah, just looking at these other two cons, I think we've more or less talked about them already. So
yeah, the next two cons are, the second one is lack of some custom modules, which I find interesting just because of one of the pros being, NPM. But yeah. I think the issue is just some of the, it's the standard kind of issues with NPM where, you're just going package shopping and you might be pulling something that's not really ready for a production environment. And the third one is native developers are still needed when you're working React Native.
Yep. And yeah, we kind of talked through that too, right? If you need specialized something or other, and I think they're related too, then you're probably going to wind up needing a native developer to bridge the gap or have one of your React Native developers figure that stuff out. But it's a separate learning curve, and so it's hard. Yeah. So I'm curious on these alternatives real quick, because I know that we have a little bit of a time requirement. Have you guys built native apps or Flutter apps or native script? Is Xamarin?
I have not. Just more the progressive web app land, but nothing in Flutter. I've listened to some talks about Dart specifically, and that's what Flutter is built in.
Yep.
And I know there's a lot of power there, but I don't have any firsthand experience.
I use Flutter on a hackathon project, and I think their assessment of this article is spot on for what I would feel like. It's interesting and appealing. It is very new, so the adoption level and just community and number of packages is much smaller. Because as a React developer, the inherent overlap with React Native is much more appealing to me than needing to learn a separate language and a separate framework without the parallels being there. The fact that it's all unified on a type-safe language could be appealing for some folks, and they mentioned native developers might like it better. Another trade-off there is the fact that Flutter takes a different user interface approach. So I'd encourage folks to look into that, where React Native uses native UI widgets, whereas Flutter draws the UI itself. So it just kind of takes a single screen, Flutter handles all of the drawing, and it has its own implementation of text boxes of buttons. And there are trade-offs there. There are pros and cons between the two that's worth looking into if you're thinking about Flutter.
Nice. And yeah, I've played with Ionic. I've played with native on both iOS and Android, and they all have a different learning curve. I haven't played with Flutter yet. I've also fiddled around with native script a bit. In a lot of ways, like native script and React Native have a lot in common because they both build their UIs out of native components, and then they do all of the business logic and other compute stuff with JavaScript, and they both work across the JavaScript bridge. Like I said, I don't know how Flutter does it. I haven't had a chance to fiddle with that one yet. One thing I have found is that the learning curve for React Native seems to be smaller than the learning curve for native iOS or native Android. And so I found it much more approachable just as a web developer to go with React Native. So there's that. Native script was kind of the same boat, has a lot in common there. Cordova does things a little bit different. Ionic was super easy. I think the learning curve for Ionic, if you're a web developer, is actually easier than React Native. But, it sticks everything into the web view and then, kind of farms out to native code to do the native stuff, the camera and things like that. So, your trade-off is in a different place there. But yeah, all in all, I really like the React Native approach, and I would probably pick it over pretty much any of the other ones. And I'm not just saying that because of this show. I'm really saying it because I've played with a lot of the other ones, and the combination between the learning curve and the way that it runs things, it just feels more natural in a lot of ways to the way that Apple and Google are thinking about Android and iOS. And so you get a lot of the niceties without having to go whole hog into the land of native code. And yeah, you may have to go delve into some native stuff for some of the things you want to do. But for the general case, especially if you're just kind of pushing data back and forth over an API and then storing it on your device so you can access it quickly, it does a pretty darn good job.
Yeah, and the article does a real good job of staying pretty biased. And at the bottom, they actually have a React Native experience, like learn from others section, where they kind of point to companies that are using React Native and some that have pulled away, like Airbnb, how Discord uses it for iOS, and Uber Eats, and how they're using it. And then they actually link to other detailed articles. So if you're listening to this as like a, should I not, I would really pay attention to that section versus the pros and cons, because that's going to be real life experience from what people are doing. And then they also talk about how it changed the whole artsy implementation of mobile development, which we've kind of talked about a little bit before as well.
Yep. Yeah. The Airbnb case is really interesting, but yeah, they had a lot of other things going on that made it, and I think this is healthy too, because then it's, this isn't a silver bullet. It's not for everybody. Right. And so as your business concerns change, you may wind up going to something else or figuring out that React Native is not the solution in the first place. And that's fair and it's fine. And I don't think anyone should be upset at anyone for making that decision. But I like that, it is a good solution for, I'd say 80 to 90% of the cases out there. And so you can go with it there. And then, we're all learning and growing. And so, as we learn and grow, we may learn and grow our way into, hey, this other thing's going to work better for us.
Definitely. Yeah. I don't, for lack of a better word, these framework wars, they all learn from each other, like before, Ember really mastered the CLI, and then Angular 2 came out and they had a great CLI, so
Angular CLI was originally built on the Ember CLI.
Yeah. So exactly. It's cool when you can kind of reach across the aisle for, and learn from each other and kind of improve on what you have going on.
Yep. 100%. Now I've got a hard stop in like 7 minutes. So unless there's something else, I'm probably going to encourage us to move to picks.
Yeah, I'm good for picks.
I could share first. I have just one pick. It is the book, It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work, by DHH and Jason. I forget Jason's last name.
Jason Fried.
Jason Fried, of Basecamp. So they are famous for Rails. They are famous for being very opinionated on things. This book is really powerful for me. It gets at kind of the core. Certainly if you're running a company, it's very helpful because it talks about how they run their company, the decisions they make. I would say as an employee, it's also helpful to describe the way things can be at work. I mean, the title just says it right there. It doesn't have to be crazy. You don't always need to be working 60 to 80 hours a week. You don't always need to be cramming more and more into every sprint. You don't always need to have bigger and bigger teams, just adding more teams and technologies to try to accomplish something good. That may not be helping. You don't have to say yes to every customer feature request. So the corporate culture that Basecamp has, I think, is really great. And I haven't worked there, and not everything in the book that I agree with, but many things in the book I very strongly agree with. And, Chuck and I have mentioned this before. I think it's something that we share. I really care about trying to help developers have a better experience and not just be very put upon by some companies that I would say are poorly run and take advantage of developers, and just to know that things can be better. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed by work, as the title would suggest, I think this book is really helpful to show you what's possible. And, to the degree that you have the experience and the ability to go out and get a new job, you can look for somewhere that's better, or you can talk to your boss or manager and set personal boundaries to have that experience where you're not just constantly being asked to work later and later and being blamed for things that go wrong. So if you're at all overwhelmed by your work experience, I definitely recommend checking out this book. And if you are a leader in your company, it's a lot of great principles about how to create a great work environment. That's all for me.
Nice.
Okay, yeah. So my tip of the week, my pick
You
is
give us one of those too.
yeah. Mine's a hybrid tip of the week. I don't know how else to phrase it, and it's not a very good pick, so I apologize. I usually like to do developer-oriented stuff, but I think just because of the time of year, this is like, I think 2 weeks till Christmas, maybe 9 days, I don't know. But I kind of came across this recently. I got a new laptop and new headphones, and I really like that financial independence movement. And one of the big things is car purchasing, and they always say, "Oh, purchase a car that's a couple years old. You obviously get a discount, it's well taken care of, and all that depreciation's been handled." And I've noticed that actually with laptops and headphones, you can kind of get away with that as well. If you go on OfferUp and LetGo, and you can get the serial number for an Apple product, if that product was purchased within the past 60 days, you can still get Apple Care on it. So that's kind of like my pick/tip of the week is you can really get a device for really reasonable price, people probably cheaper than anywhere else, and still get Apple Care on it, so you're still protected. So check that out. You just get the serial number, and Apple has a website. You type it in, they tell you can get Apple Care on it. And that's it for me.
Nice. I'm going to throw in a couple of picks here. The first one is just the system that I use to kind of do time management. It's a video that John Sonmez actually put out several years ago, and I've kind of adapted it to my own purposes. It's worked out really well. But I use Kanban Flow, which is kind of like a Trello board and things like that. And so what I do is I have basically a swim lane is what they call them in Kanban boards. So I have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And then I have all of the tasks in there color coded. So all of the ones that I have to do today are colored green. All of the kind of the default ones that aren't assigned to anything. So when I create a new task, it's yellow. And then, I can assign it to green if it's something that I have to do today. And then the podcast recordings are in pink. Or I guess it's red. I don't know. It's pink, red, pink. Anyway, so I just get in, and then it has a Pomodoro timer stuck in it. And so I just start the Pomodoro timer when we start doing whatever it is we're doing, and then I end it, or it'll end on its own. So for right now, I have the React Native Radio task running, and it says that I've been running it for more than 25 minutes because my Pomodoro was up, 15 minutes ago or something. But that works out really well. And then what it allows me to do is then I can go and I can look and I can say, okay. And when I finish a task, I just move it over into the done column, and I just set this up every week and then just work through it. And so it's been pretty nice. And I wind up usually having 1, 2, or 3 things that I have to do every day. So right now, my green tasks for today are prospecting, follow-up, reading my scriptures and doing that kind of study, finding hosts for the shows. I've got a couple of ads for advertisers I need to record. And then I've got a lineup guest for a new show we're starting next year in partnership with an online training company. And so those are those. And then the other ones are, working on a side project I've got. I'm trying to get JavaScriptForum.net up and running, and get some posts in there and things like that. I'm also looking for moderators and stuff like that, but just working through that, writing some blog posts, writing email campaigns. I have a couple of calls with sponsors or advertisers today and, throughout the rest of the week. And so that has a task in there, and email has a task in there. And then I have React Native Radio and Adventures in DevOps that I'm recording today. So those are in pink. So that's kind of how I go. And then, I can just kind of keep track of, I spent some time on this. I spent some time on that. I spent however long on email, but it gives me a way of just working through the system and knowing, okay, I got everything done I needed to do today. And then I can go and, do whatever else I'm going to do today. So a lot of times if I don't get the green tasks done, then I'll go downstairs, have dinner, hang out with my family, and then I will come back up here and finish it up. And so, the green stuff is stuff that I've committed to today. So sometimes I wind up pushing email off for a few days just because it's yellow. to get the green stuff done. So anyway, that's kind of the system I have. And then I'm not sure when this is coming out, but I should have a Kickstarter coming up soon. And it's going to be for essentially a system for you to get audio courses. So there are a lot of video course systems out there. I could recommend a few like Thinkster or Pluralsight, but nobody's doing that sort of content in audio format. And I've had a lot of people talk to me about how nice it is to have the podcasts to kind of hit those topics and dive into them. So yeah, we can't show you code on audio, but the fact that we have enough to talk about every week in audio tells me that there's room for audio courses. So you can go check that out. I'll have a link to it in the show notes if the Kickstarter is up. And if not, then just keep an ear out, because I will announce when it's coming out and when you can go support it on Kickstarter, when you can sign up. So yeah, those are my picks. I'm done.
All right. Well, that's what was that project tracking software called? That was really cool.
I'm using Kanban Flow.
All right. Well, cool. And that's all I got. Josh, you got anything else before we head out?
I'm good.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in to React Native Radio, and we will see you next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.